This week, Iain McKell, a distinguished British photographer and filmmaker, celebrated for his powerful portraits and social documentary work, particularly his chronicling of British youth subcultures since the late 1970s. Now, McKell has just released a book on the New Romantics, which he documented after moving to London in 1980, and whom he met at clubs like Blitz. Now, with many before unseen photographs, McKell has managed to produce honest, poetic, visual narratives that explore themes of rebellion, identity, and belonging in the artists and characters who would make the greatest impact in fashion, film, and music during the 1980s, and many of them up to the present day. Iain McKell, welcome. We're going to talk about the New Romantic era and this fabulous book, which is really a document of that time. And I want to get to that in a second, but I want to talk about your upbringing first, because I want to find out your route to photography and what really influenced you in your childhood. So where were you brought up and what creativity were you brought up around?
Okay, well, thanks. First of all, say thanks very much for inviting me on. It's very exciting and nice to meet you. So my childhood, well, I was born in Cyprus. My father was in the police force, so we were in Nicosia. So on my passport, it's like I'm born in Nicosia. But there were troubles back then in Cyprus, and so they decided, my parents, to move back to the UK. My father originally, being a Scot, from Glasgow, but like all good Scots, they travelled south and met my mum at, I think it was some army-based dance, in Weymouth in Dorset, and yeah, so they moved back when I was 2 years old. Growing up in a seaside town, Weymouth, very pretty place, Weymouth, actually. Culturally a little bit, of a backwater. One thing I miss is that kind of white sand, the cliffs, that kind of Jurassic coastline kind of thing, But on the other hand, it's much more kind of diverse and interesting, in London by the sea, as they say. My parents were hoteliers, so I grew up in a hotel. I had a sea view, I had a room, one of the guest rooms, obviously back then. I have memories of having a sea view and banana toothpaste. Actually, I remember that.
It does sound like a place where you wouldn't necessarily come into contact, in those formative years with subcultures or a lot of creativity, maybe through the television or through buying records. So in terms of photography, what was your first sort of contact with photography?
Well, interesting enough, creatively, I think the first time sort of subculture was sort of something that interested me was on visiting London as, I don't know, maybe I was about 10 or something, and going to, I guess it was Carnaby Street, something like that, most probably was Carnaby Street. And there were these postcard racks, and they had these postcard illustrations, which were, the one was a sort of biker guy, and another one was like a hippie. They were kind of like iconic kind of drawings of subculture characters, which is interesting because it is, by its nature, it is iconic, isn't it? Because it has this sort of look, doesn't it? Each type of, if it's a biker or Hell's Angel, or the Hell's Angel has its colors. But I can remember now, I don't have the cards now, but I remember it was a biker guy, and he was like lying down, had a leather jacket on, and sort of like those kind of boots with the white socks at the top, and with jeans tucked in and like a white sock. That was a very kind of biker look, wasn't it? And he had aviator sunglasses on. and he looked really cool, you know. And I remember that. And the hippie one, I think, was a girl or young woman, like in a sort of floral paisley miniskirt or something, you know. And I remember I used to draw them. I copied them, you know, as a 10-year-old. So there was the interest. Do you know what I mean? I think subconsciously or something, it was sort of there. In later years, I ended up going. Yeah, I was at art college in Exeter, and I was doing graphic design. I actually went to art college at I was 17. You know what? I always knew that I always, you know, when you're a kid, it's like, what are you going to be when you grow up? You know, and I always wanted to be an artist. So that was quite in me, you know, quite young, as far as I can remember. And I was always like doing extra art classes. I was very confident in the art room. I always felt good in the art room because I was normally near the top or at the top. So that gave me a good feeling, didn't it? And I used to do extra classes in it. And I used to draw a lot. I'm a really, well, I am. I should really say I was, when I was at art college, a really good draftsman. I mean, I could draw really well. I went to a boarding school in Bristol. I went to Clifton College, but I never felt like I fitted in at all. I was too young. I went there at 11, so I didn't understand really why that was. But this boy, who was also called Ian, actually, I remember his first name, Ian. His father was like the CEO or some really high up guy at Bristol City Football Club. And I was invited to a football game. So we were sitting in the box, you know, the total privileged place, isn't it? Right. And I remember sitting in this box with him and his dad. And I looked over to the goal, and there was about 2,000 skinheads behind the goal, like really chanting. And I wasn't watching the match. I was just watching them because I just thought, wow, you know, an atmosphere at a football ground is pretty impressive anyway. Do you know what I mean? Or any big game, imagine any big game is, but you know, football, you know, the sound of the supporters is sort of quite an interesting atmosphere. But in particular, because they were skinheads, they all had their boots on and they were kicking the corrugated iron fence under the shed sort of thing, and making this noise. And I was just totally captivated by it. And I remember being in the city centre in a cafe, and this boy walked in. And so his back's to me, he's facing the counter, and he's got a gingham shirt on, braces, Levi's, loafers or DMs, and then didn't think anything of it. Then another one walked in, identical, but just a blue gingham instead of red gingham. And then a third one. So there were 3 in a row. And it suddenly clicked in my mind, this is a subculture. This is subculture. This is a gang. This is a tribe. This is an identity. And I decided I was going to be a skinhead. So I was the only skinhead in the school.
You mentioned a couple of really interesting things there. I'm going to jump a bit, but the first of all is being sent to boarding school when you're 11 years old is basically having the umbilical cord cut for good, isn't it?
Oh, God, yeah.
You know, and a lot of people that go to boarding school and have that cut with their parents, it actually allows them to be free to live their own life earlier on than others.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Although I didn't see it like that at the time.
No, I don't think anyone does it. They see it as sort of in a very negative way. But actually, I think you can create your own destiny. The other thing is with the subcultures, in that era, right up until the sort of the late 70s, none of those subcultures really mixed, did they? You were either one thing or another, but you were never both.
Well, that's true. But at the same time, I think in small towns like Weymouth, in the classroom, you'd have one who's a skinhead and one that was a rocker. And you know what I mean? So your kind of mates it was sort of diverse in that sense. Do you know what I mean? Because it was too small a place to actually have enough to be kind of like one identity. So it was a bit of this and a bit of that, kind of like, you know, kind of mixing together. But I think definitely there was as well on the bigger theme this idea of you were one and not the other. And of course, you had the mods and rockers in Brighton, didn't you? And the scrapping that went on, and tribalism, was very much part of the sort of culture. Going back to your point you were making, let's stick to your question about boarding school and about the idea of being independent. I think that's true. I think it has served me well in my life.
I presume Exeter Art College is where you got introduced to different elements.
That's right.
And
yes.
What attracted you to a camera?
Well, I remember, I had never thought about photography at all, although my neighbor, who was father, was a photographer. And I remember childhood memories of running, playing hide and seek or something and going into this dark room that he had in his house and stuff. But it never occurred to me there was anything creative or interesting about photography whatsoever. I remember actually as well seeing when I was at Bristol at school, they had a sort of evening class in photography, and I just remember this guy. I think it was a teacher or something. He had a piece of bromide paper that was badly printed. It was like grey, right, and covered in dust. Right, hadn't been cleaned, and I just thought that just looks a pile of shit. I'm not interested in that whatsoever. It actually really put me off photography because this print was so badly done. Maybe it was a test strip or something. I don't know, but it was interesting because that was my another moment. So I had first of all this sort of dark root neighbour's dad who was a high street photographer. But quite a talented guy, actually. But that sort of generation, they would do high street weddings and all that stuff. I think he did have talent, but was not using it really. But so there was that. Then there was this sort of seeing some sort of weird print that I thought was just a load of rubbish, and it didn't interest me at all. But then when I went to art college, there was, got photography this week. And suddenly I was excited. I remember thinking, oh, great, I'm interested in that. And it was the idea that I think it was the graphicness, the graphic quality of photography. That's how I remember it. It's like, oh, you can do graphic things with it. And so actually, yes, somebody had taken a sheet of paper and had put a pair of scissors on it and put it out in the sunlight, and then you bring it in, and then you've got the actual silhouette of the scissors on the paper. And I remember thinking that was interesting. I thought, oh my God, look at this. The possibilities of photography are more than I kind of even began to understand. Do you know what I mean? That was an interesting thing. And then, I did a bit of photography. I think the first photograph I took was some old guy in a public toilet. with a flash on it. And I remember the lecturer saying, oh, this is good, you're using flash, that's quite a difficult thing, just off the bat, And I remember as well, they gave us, I think there were Pentax 35mm reflex cameras. And they said, right, go out for the afternoon, take pictures. And they went, this is the aperture, this is the speed. And there's a needle inside as a light meter. You just get it in the middle. Right, and you go turn that one that way, and get it in the middle. And I thought, oh, okay. So I kind of went away looked at it and thought, oh, I get it. Just got to do that, and I've just got to do that, and I get the exposure. That's easy. So then I just forgot about that, but I was looking. It was about looking. It was about framing. It was about composition. It was about content, and having had that, instinctive composition, because I could do really good life drawing and I knew how to compose as a creative. It's just in your DNA, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? You're not taught that. That's just inside you, and it's just ready to come out, isn't it? And there was this book. It was a photography book, and it was Diane Arbus. So this is the first photography book I'd ever looked at or seen, right? So there was these weird twins on the cover, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I opened it up. And I thought, Jesus Christ, these portraits are unbelievable. Do you know what I mean? They're like visceral, they're aggressive, they're strange. They were just like otherworldly. But what really went off in my head, the light bulb this was the real light bulb moment, was that when I looked at this work and thought, oh, who's it? Oh, it's by Diane Arbus, this American photographer, street photographer from New York. And I was thinking, what really struck me was however strong these portraits were, it was informing me about her. It was showing me her mind. And I realized at that moment that it wasn't, and I also noticed that nobody was credited. And I think that was very deliberate because it's not about the subject, it's about the person taking the photograph. So I could see it was about her psyche and how photography was a very powerful psychological medium that through this sort of window into this sort of world of people, you could really kind of become an author yourself and a self-expression through people being muses, in effect. And I've always seen photography like that. I have no sympathy for anyone that says, you didn't ask to take my picture. You know, that's not polite. You know, I really, although I do ask a lot because I want a certain type of picture sometimes, right? I want it, but sometimes you don't. You know, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But if I do want to do a portrait, then I do want their consent because I want to interact with them, which is really what I was doing with the New Romantic portraits. It's very much about that. It's very much about that relationship. But I still think that it is about having the signature, you know, as a photographer. It is about having your voice.
That's really fascinating what you're saying, because it is, you know, when I write anything, it is in essence, the deeper essence is about me. Not the story, not the outer story, but the deeper essence of it. Now, in terms of these photographs, at one point you go up to London, and I think you went to Billy's, you went to a nightclub in London, and it was the moment that you sort of met this burgeoning scene, as it were. Can you remember the first time you were in what would become a scene and what it was to you?
Yes. Well, I guess, you know, here's the thing. You just made me think, you know, when I referred to that football match I went to, what I didn't say, just to finish that, was that I secretly, the following week, I mean, I say secretly because it was almost like, not that I felt guilty about it, but I had this sort of idea that I'm going to go back on my own and not sit in this box and actually not go to watch football, but I'm going to go back and I'm going to stand in that middle of those kids, the 2,000 kids that are chanting, just to have that experience. Do you know what I mean? And I mean, there's a lot of psychological things in that alone. You know, the idea of, you know, the group, you know, the mob, or the identity of, you know, a big group of people. I mean, before London, I was working in my summer holidays as a seaside photographer on Weymouth seafront. So that was when I was starting to sort of hone my practice with it. And I did a book which came out in 2019, just before COVID, called Private Reality, which was my original title, I called it. And then we added to it Diary of a Teenage Boy. And basically I was working for this firm, I think they were called Smiley Photos, and it was all M prints, you know, machine printed. So you take on a half frame Olympus that were half 35mm, and that's where the profit was. And you take these pictures and they were color machine printed. But at the same time, I carried my own Olympus OM1 that was advertised by Don McCullen and David Bailey in the sort of photo magazines as otherwise good enough for them. And it's a beautiful camera, very clear frame, beautiful shutter. I mean, there's a whole kind of like fetish to cameras, you know, and the Olympus OM1 has to stand alone for its elegant. It's a very elegant camera. And so that kind of emotional connection with the camera as well, and looking through it and seeing the blackness and just this, all that intensity had real meaning to me. It wasn't like a phone where you just go snap. Do you know what I mean? I worship this little beautiful object. Do you know what I mean? And everything about it, and just the sound that the shutter made, and the whole kind of organic relationship with it was very much part of, just like picking up a pen and drawing, doing a life drawing. I saw photography no different to that, you know. Anyway, during that process of Weymouth, you did get the odd Londoner come down or whatever. Some guy dressed as a really sharp mod, or there was some punks couple of punk guys. So that's all in that work. But came to London. I knew no one in London. I had a job as what they called a lick and stick boy back then. That's when, when you used to have Letrasets and PMTs, which is black and white type, and you have to cut and paste it, which is all the skills I learned at art college doing graphics. And I was working as a junior, and I was made redundant after 9 months. When was this? Yeah, 79, 80, just beginning of 80. I was walking down Wardour Street, and I just saw this sign, and it was Bowie night. And I thought, I'm a child of the 70s, right? Bowie's the man. I love Bowie. I was obsessed with Bowie when I was at art college, when I was, like I say, 17, 18, it's this sort of man from Mars, it was all very, wow. So I went down to this club and walked in, and there it was.
Don't go away. More of Iain McKell coming up, but please comment, subscribe, and follow my podcast and watch all the podcasts on popthehistorymakers.com. Okay, let's get back to photographer Iain McKell.
So when I saw this, I just thought, this is it. It served me on lots of levels, because I was looking for friends as well.
So it was a sense of belonging, of being part of it yourself. Yeah.
Like when I went behind the goal with the skinheads, here it is in a nightclub. Do you know what I mean? A sense of, something going on. And and I just made this decision. I remember leaving the club. I didn't take any pictures. I didn't have a camera with me. I just was experiencing it. But I decided, that's it. I'm gonna go buy a Hasselblad. I'm gonna go medium format. I knew I had it in my head what I was going to do. I'm going to photograph this scene. I'm going to subvert it. I'm going to own it, and I'm going to do it in medium format. And my inspiration for that was Irving Penn. Irving Penn's Small Rooms, when he took a canvas tent thing around the world photographing tribes. Because I can immediately thought, these are peacock punks. I could see that it was punky, but it was a kind of it was punk on on acid. It's like it was something more extreme and flamboyant, and it was clearly kind of all inclusive. I think, and it was, everybody was mixed. It was heterosexual, gay. It was whatever you want, right? As long as you're cool, you're in. As long as you have an aesthetic, as long as you kind of understand this, and it was just a real light bulb moment. That I was going to not get a job as a designer. I'm going to do this full time. I'm going to be a photographer and commit myself. That's how inspired I was.
But what's interesting is that you're not taking photos in the club.
Yes.
You've set yourself up. And yeah. I think because of Irving Penn and this idea of the sort of sophistication and attention to detail there is in that work is what transpires and allows you to set up a studio to be able to incorporate those elements in your work as well.
Or is it like you don't know what you don't know, right? But I knew instinctively that this was a very cool thing to do, that photography somehow at that level was something that only a certain you had to engage with it intellectually, and it was very creative. And it was nothing to what I used to think photography was before then, growing up or whatever. The influence of photography was advertising or, ephemeral photography that just was sort of around you in your world. But I never saw that as anything really creative or, that it could be a fine art, at all.
In the early part of this, which wasn't even named New Romantic Era, but all the people in that sort of early part were later to become the icons of the 80s in all different areas. Now you're setting out to photograph. Who did you choose at first and why? Were you going for sort of people that you felt were key leaders in that scene?
No, not really. No, I can only remember in that club that night. I remember there was a guy called Philip Salon. He was there, who was originally a punk. I think Chris Sullivan was there, who was originally a punk.
There are some amazing names. And what I love about the photos is because we're now looking back at a particular era, you can view them and the people differently. And as you said, it's the photographs are as much about you as they are about them. So with someone like Vivienne Westwood, yeah. What do you think you particularly brought out in Vivienne Westwood that relates to you?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah. So here's the thing, right? When I had this idea, right, I'm not going to shoot it in the club. Okay. So I made this conscious idea not to do that. And of course, you know, Homer Sykes, Derek Ridges, particularly those photographers did. You know, they were so beautiful. Their silhouette was so kind of like graphic, and doing them in the club where you knew by kind of, you know, after a couple of drinks and, you know, a dance or two, it's all going to fall apart, right? And it gets messy, and that's the sort of contradiction in a way. You know, they turn up fantastic and they leave wrecked, you know. So I didn't want that. I wanted to capture this perfection, this fantasy they had, this sort of idea of this romantic idea. Now, this was before the New Romantic tag came by the press. I mean, I've called the book New Romantic because it's a no-brainer. I can't remember, but I must have had cards that I gave out to people saying, I've got this pop-up studio. Please come on. I'm there every Thursday afternoon. Come along, I'll photograph you. And I sat there. I, you know, went ahead with this whole process, set up my backdrop, and I waited. And they came. And they came, and they came, right? And so one afternoon, Vivienne Westwood turns up out of blue. Now, Vivienne didn't go to the Blitz Club, or Billy's for that matter, you know, but she was very much in tune, wasn't she? You know, from the punk to the New Romantic. She was at that point doing her pirate collection. And, you know, after that portrait, around that time, she went from a little small shop in World's End, at the end of the King's Road. She went massive. So she just turned up out of the blue. Now, I never asked her how she, you know, it was like I knew who she was. She was still on the scene, very kind of, you know, a high profile, you know, an icon in that world, but not really beyond that, you know, that was to come. So she just turned up, and it was like, and I was talking to Chris, and he said, yeah, he said, well, actually, he said, I actually had dinner with her, and I was telling her that he said, tomorrow I'm going to this pop-up studio, this photographer's doing this project, and I'm going to go along. So she heard about it through word of mouth, you know, through someone that she respected opinions from, you know, and she got herself ready, made the journey, spent a couple of hours with me, and I was no one, but they bought into it. Do you know what I mean? And that, I didn't plan that, but I just had this idea of how I artistically wanted to approach it. Vivienne just turned up. I spent time with her. We did the pictures. And now looking back, I mean, by the process doing this book, the picture I'm using on the cover of Vivienne actually wasn't my first choice. My first choice was some anonymous character. Interestingly enough, down the years, coincidentally, I became very good friends with her sons, both Joe and Ben. She's got two sons. I mean, Ben particularly, I'm very close to. And I sent him the picture the other day. I said, this is my book I'm doing, Ben. Look, here's your mum. and he was like, I've never seen this picture before. And that was the point I was trying to make, actually. I have never showing that picture's been in my archive my whole life, right? And it was only at this process. I've got other shots of her. There's another shot in the book where you see more full length and she's taking the jacket off. And I had that in the edit, but I can't have two shots, or maybe I can, And in the end, I have got a few people there's two shots of actually. But that shot, suddenly it was like, oh my God, she's barreling down the lens there. She's looking right. It's such an intense, intimate image of her. It's really powerful, I think. And how that's only come to fruition now. I took that picture 45 years ago and I had those sessions with people. And I've only really finished the whole process into entirety now with getting it all collected together into the book. Do you know what I mean? Finally. Do you know what I mean?
For me, there's this massive strength and determination that you see within her.
Yes.
And if what you're saying is it is also about you, then it's also about your strength and determination.
Yes, I think that's so true. And maybe that's something she saw in me. Do you know what I mean? Like we were both young, but she's older than me, by 20 years, But back then, I mean, that's interesting how she must have been viewing me. Do you know what I mean? This young kid, 22-year-old. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd only just bought a Hasselblad. I didn't even, I remember it jamming once and having to phone up the fucking, having to phone up this photography, where I don't think I'd rented it, but, and say, listen, the thing's broke. It's not working. And they said, no, you take the back off, go inside. There's a little screw. Get a screwdriver. You've got to turn it. It's like a little thing that it's a spring that needs to be reloaded. And we're right, okay, oh yeah, okay, it's working now. I knew nothing, and but I had the eye, I had the passion, and I had the vision.
Well, tell me about other people that came to the studio, because there's some amazing names. Billy Idol, for example.
Oh my God, yeah, that was amazing too. I got a portfolio together before the New Romantics. I'm sure I had this work that I was going around record companies with, and I got this gig shooting Billy Idol for EMI. No, not EMI. I can't remember now the record company. They're gone now anyway, but he was the label he was with at the time. The art director, they had this job and it was photographing Billy's face. So I did these portraits of Billy for his album cover. So I think what happened was his girlfriend, Perri Lister, who's amazing. I mean, she turns up with Billy. So what I think Perri was really close to Steve Strange. She's in his videos and stuff. So they turn up. I think Perri had said, look, there's a photographer doing. I think she informed him. And he must be, well, hang on a minute. I know that photographer. He did my album cover, right? So they turn up. But this is the thing that's interesting. Another thing to do with the intimacy and with this whole setup that I've created. So she says, right, we're going naked. And it's like, okay, right, okay. And so, it all came off. And then she had these Vivienne Westwood leggings and some white muslin, because I did ask people to bring, or I did at the beginning. I think I gave up on this idea down the road, but Stephen Jones, I remember saying, bring something with you. He brought a hat, Willie Brown bought a dog. Perri bought her body. She brought her body with her, right? She brought her body and some muslin, right? So, and there they were, and I shot them, and this was like not completely private. It's in the orangery with big glass windows in a park where people could walk past, but it did have central heating, and it was February. So, but they were just really comfortable with this idea. Now, that wouldn't have happened in a nightclub.
One of the big bands of that era were Spandau Ballet. And of course, Martin Kemp was at Blitz, and he appears in your book.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, actually. I've got the book here, actually. This is The New Romantics. I've got Vivienne on the cover, Vivienne Westwood. And then, the shot of... so there you go. I love actually the way, first of all, I said, I love the way he's got this hanky. It's such a little detail, but it's a beautiful kind of, cotton, and it's got his initial on it as well, and it really kind of gives it that romantic touch, doesn't it? I think, it's like, it was all about, the devil's in the detail, isn't it, as they say? And first time I met them was personally was through Steve Dagger, their manager, and it was in Carnaby Street. There was a shop, and he's another guy in the book called John Baker, also known as Mole. And he ran this shop and he was selling new romantic clothes, and they had an office there. It was like a little HQ in Carnaby Street. And there was this whole conversation about the media, just sort of, it's been in the media about new romantics. You know, before that, I mean, when I was photographing them, they didn't have a name. It was just like a scene. It was sort of, I knew it was punk, but it was sort of progression from punk, but it didn't really have that tag to it at all. Later on, I think Robert Elms wrote the article, A Cult with No Name, but they were actually literally went in, and it was like several people there, and it was like discussing about the this idea that are we happy with this new romantic tag? It's like, is it, and it's like, well, you haven't really got, it's a bit like punk. That happened the same way, wasn't it? It was really the tabloids that kind of came up with this punk strapline, and it stuck, and new romantics the same.
You mentioned John Baker.
Yes.
And that he had a shop in Carnaby Street. He became quite a big person in the music industry, didn't he, later?
Yes, that's right. Actually, he I think he went on to establish hip hop or something. I'm not actually an expert on this, but you're right. I think I have heard about his career and success.
Yeah, he went over to New York,
and
then he worked with
yes.
those hip hop artists, and yeah, you're right. He really did help to establish that, and obviously an interesting character in a different. I mean, it's it's in a music area, which many of them were in, but it was a different force to a certain extent, and so that made him quite interesting. One of the hits of the early '80s, I think, in 1982. Was Haysi Fantayzee.
Haysi Fantayzee, yeah, John, that's right, yeah. Kate Garner and Jeremy Healy.
And they're, of course, in your book.
And, an interest, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Jeremy Healy went on to be like a major, I mean, he was a DJ then, I went to my first real warehouse party, which was a Jeremy Healy party off Tottenham Court Road somewhere. And I remember it was on the top floor, and it had lots of skylights, and there was. I was under the realization that this is actually, it was getting late. It was getting to the early hours of the morning, and I actually thought, it was the first time I thought, oh my god, it's going to be daylight. This is an all nighter. And I actually literally left. This is commitment. I left the party and went home and got my camera, because I would go and party like anyone else. Do you know what I mean? But because it was going to be dawn, I thought, I can't miss this opportunity. So I went home. I used to live in Waterloo. That's not that far away, I guess. I got my camera and went back to the party just to photograph having this moment of dawn. And Kate actually had an exhibition or something a few years back, and I went to that. Interesting. Yeah, that Jeremy went on as well to be this major Ibiza DJ. That was something that he really forged, I believe. So it's interesting how these people definitely had, went on to things sort of.
One of the major designers was Stephen Linard, of course.
I mean, Steve.
He's in the book.
Yeah, and sadly, he's passed away now, but I went to Stephen's, he did a show. There was this iconic moment when Stephen Linard had a menswear show, Fashion Week in London. And there was, I think Chris Sullivan was in it, Christos was in it, a guy called Dowell, who he lived actually as a neighbor in Waterloo, actually. He was one of my muses. I used him quite a lot for shoots I did for Italian Vogue. And so he was in that show. And so there was all these sort of characters, and they were wearing these white ruffled shirts and sort of, it's like black suits with white ruffled shirts. And it had this sort of, excitement around it. It was like I was sort of following what was going on, so I went to this fashion show, and that picture was a sort of moment in time when I think he was, just graduating really, and it was, everybody, all the models were from the scene, from the, the new was called then the New Romantics.
One name that has come up many times during this interview is Chris Sullivan, of course. Now, Chris wrote the foreword to the book, New Romantics. He's obviously, a close friend of yours, and you've obviously known him for many years. But how well did you know him at that period when you took the photo? And tell me about his photo in the book.
Well, here's the thing, right? When Chris came along, I didn't actually realize, but he turned up for his sitting and wearing this beautiful white, fantastic outfit. I mean, Chris does have this sort of amazing aesthetic, and he had just, we all have different talents, I guess, and Chris is just very good at that. He sort of like knows what he's doing, and he put this look together and stuff, took it very seriously. And apparently, I was talking the other day, and I said, we're talking about the cover, and at one point I was thinking about having just an anonymous girl from the city, not anonymous, but just, they were all icons, they were all heroes, right? Everyone was a hero for it, we can be heroes. And there was a club called Club for Heroes, wasn't there, and which I went to. So I just had this idea, they were all, the look is so strong, you don't need to have Vivienne Westwood on the cover. This was my thinking, and I was talking to Chris, and I just said, this is during the process of writing for the book, and I said, Chris, do you think I'm missing a trick not putting Vivienne on the cover? And he said, yeah, you're bonkers, and then I said, well, yeah, because I don't want to look like I'm selling, putting a celebrity on, I hate that word, celebrity, but, someone so recognizable and with her history, and, that it overshadows, the artisticness of my photography, right? But actually, he said, no, Ian, the thing is, she was very, very, she was New Romantic. She was part of it all. She didn't go to the club, but she was very involved because she was tuned in, right? Because punk, after all, you've got punk. It was from punk that that the New Romantic scene evolved. It was really punk, but like taking it on another level. It's like a progression, isn't it? It's like an evolving process, and that happens in any creativity. Whether you're a songwriter or a fashion designer or a photographer or a painter, you'll keep pushing the envelope, don't you? Right? But maybe
what did you get Boy George to bring, and what did you think you managed to really capture with him?
I have put this in the book as well, that it started at the Orangery, and Vivienne and Billy and a lot of people were shot there. But that work was then, a portfolio was shown to English Vogue, and they commissioned me to do some more. So the second phase of the project, I took the canvas from out of the Orangery and into a nightclub. So it was a half breed. Do you know what I mean? It was like you step over here onto the canvas. So with George, he was part of that session. He came in and he was wearing what he was wearing, and I just shot him as he was. Do you know what I mean? But I also did shoot with Sue Chloe, who is in the book as well, who did all the Culture Club clothes. And I shot Boy George, or George O'Dowd, for the Face magazine. But I remember meeting George before that night in that Blitz. I remember meeting him that first night. And I remember thinking, this guy's extraordinary. Not just how he looked, but how his character was. He was so articulate. He was really young, but he had this aura. I remember standing in front of him and he was just babbling on to me. And I was just thinking, you're extraordinary. He just he had something. I could sense that about him. Do you know what I mean? His confidence, his openness, friendliness. George has always been really friendly, warm sort of guy. I feel that's my opinion anyway. My experience of George has been a kind of very cool person, and so he definitely stood out from the crowd.
So, Iain, where can we get this book?
Well, there's this exhibition, of course, coming up in September. Opens, I think, the 20th September at the Kensington Design Museum, Blitz, the club that shaped the 80s. And they're selling it in their shop. So that show's on for 6 months. However, people can contact me direct on social media, either Facebook or Instagram. My handle is just my name, Iain McKell. Iain, Celtic spelling, Scottish with 2 I's, Iain. MCKELL. Yeah, you can reach out to me directly, and you can buy a book for me direct and get a discount, and I can sign it for you as well. So it has that personal touch, just like the portraits had that personal, intimate feel to the book, and keep that whole idea of intimacy and have your own copy of it.
Brilliant, Iain. I'll put all the details below. It's perfect. So thank you very much. I just want to say that it has been a real pleasure talking to you, because I found out a lot about how you work and this relationship between you and the subject, and how there's part of you in the picture, which I found completely fascinating. I love the book. I think there's some brilliant photos in there. And of course, there's many unseen photographs, which makes it completely original. So
yeah,
Iain McKell, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.